All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. It's time for lesson 2. This lesson in psychology is going to be Introduction to Psychology, really looking at the science itself and trying to figure out what does it study, a little bit about its history, doing some quick definitions that we're going to need for this course, and then really kind of starting to look at the science overall, and finally finishing up with some idea of what people do in the field. What are some career choices? What do people do with a psychology degree? So that'll be the focus of today, and then we'll move on. Once you're done listening to this, you can do your reading and your assignment for the week. What I'm going to try to do every single video is spotlight some sort of a mental or psychological disorder. And many of these will be incredibly rare and unique, and some of them will be things that you've heard of before. And it's just a way to kind of spotlight some of the things that happen with the mind. It's an incredibly complex set of relationships that lead to our mind, and not always do those work quite right, and people have disorders, mental disorders. And so I wanted to talk about some of those. And today we're going to start off with one that is very, very rare. It only impacts, as you can see, about 12 people a year, and it's called the Paris disorder. This is just a great idea to think about, how amazingly complex and odd the mind is, that it could lead to something like this occurring. So the Paris disorder is, like its name would suggest, something that happens in Paris, France. It is unique to Japanese tourists, so no one else on the planet besides the Japanese are ever afflicted by this disorder. And it leads to a full mental breakdown. It leads to the people having no ability to essentially self-manage based on the impact of this disorder. And what scientists have found, what psychologists have found, is that it is a form of culture shock. So think about yourself. If you go to a place that you're not familiar with and are trying to figure out how things work and what the rules are there, it's a little daunting, it's a little scary, and it's a little intimidating. And this is what happens for the Japanese that are afflicted by this disorder. And it really is something that's based on the fact that their idea of what Paris will be, this idyllic system of this beautiful city and incredible culture and wonderful people that maybe they've seen in movies, doesn't match up with the fact that Paris is a big bustling city with great people and not so nice people and the whole 9 yards. And so when they are confronted with this reality check, something that doesn't match their mental image, they break down. They're unable to handle it. And the Japanese embassy actually has a hotline and has people that are standing by ready to help the Japanese tourists that are afflicted by this. So it's just kind of an interesting spotlight to think about the power of the mind and how it can lead to incredible heights and incredible lows depending on what's going on. Before we really begin with the science, we really need to define what the heck is psychology. Psychology is defined as the scientific study of human behavior and mental processes. Okay, the scientific study of human behavior and mental processes. Well, that's lovely. That sounds like a lot of big words. What does it mean? Well, it really means that psychology is the study of what you think, feel, and do. Okay, so that's the easiest way we can put it into terms that we can all understand. If you're studying about how you think, how you feel, or how you do things, you're probably studying psychology. Psychology is a social science, but it really is focused on scientific principles. So it is systematic, which means when you're studying psychology or studying disorders in psychology, you're working through things in a systematic way, 1 to 2 to 3. And it's observational. And observational is based on, we're not making conclusions based on nothing or guesses or what we think might be the case. We're making it on observed behaviors that we see in people. So those connect with the concept of the scientific method. If you think about your science classes, that sounds familiar. We don't say, hey, I think I understand how this works because I think it should work that way. We go through a very systematic approach using the scientific method to figure out what's going on. Okay. All right. What are some of the goals of psychology? Psychology is really can be divided up into 4 goals of trying to understand how things work when dealing with the human mind and the human mental processes. And that is that psychologists seek to describe what's going on. So they're looking, that's the observational piece. Explain, that's where they're making some connections between what they see and what they think is going on. Predict, that's by understanding what I see, I can predict what will happen next or who it will happen in. And then potentially a fourth goal is to influence. And that's to change the way people behave, maybe to move the needle a little bit in terms of how people behave, to influence them in a way, now that we know how something is working, in a more positive way. And psychology is really, it's the concept of a pure science versus an applied science. Pure science really is all about looking and understanding how the universe works. And psychology, that's how the mind works. Applied science is taking that and doing something with it. And the best analogy I can give you is if you think about physics. Physics is, when you're trying to understand how the universe functions, that's a pure science. When you take that and you try to then figure out how to do something with it, or influence something, then you're dealing with an applied science. Okay, so psychology, as you're hearing me talk about these terms, really is associated with trying to understand why things happen, predict when they will happen, and influence their outcome. Again, psychology is a science. It is a social science because we're dealing with people. It is a little different than history, where even though we try to predict what will happen in history, we're really looking at what's happened before. So it's not a predictive science so much as psychology is. Psychology really trying to figure out why people do what they do and how we can figure that out. Conclusions about behavior, how people function, can be made through careful experimentation, just like you would do in any other kind of science, chemistry, biology, physics, etc. And it's done using the scientific method. So here's a graph on the right-hand side that shows some of the elements of the scientific method. These will be familiar to you. You have a hypothesis, then you develop an experiment, you collect data, you form conclusions. And the reason I use this particular graph is I like that it's in a circle, and it really does give you hopefully the idea that it's not a linear process. It's not something that you make a hypothesis, you end it with a conclusion, and you're all done. No, it goes around all the time trying to figure out why things happen. So it's a continuous process. And the theories that come out of this process are always being attacked, being rethought, being reconsidered to make sure they're as accurate as they can be. All right, another critical thing we need to talk about is the mind. We're going to talk about the mind a lot. And sometimes, and I would do it too, we have two terms that we kind of use interchangeably, the mind and the brain. And for psychology, we're going to kind of tease those out. Those are going to be different terms. It's going to be important for us to know that those are different things, and we're going to approach them differently. So let's talk about what is the mind and what is the brain. The mind is the part, and it's an ephemeral part. It's not a part that you can put your hands on. It's the piece of what makes us a human being that enables us to be aware of the world, our experiences, how we think and to feel. Okay, so all those kind of things. So how can we be aware of the world? How can we think and how can we feel? Those kind of things that are going on are happening in what we would consider the mind. But I couldn't put my finger on exactly where the mind is. The brain is a little different. The brain is more of a scientific and physical thing. The brain is an organ. The brain is in your head, and the brain is responsible for coordinating bodily functions. So when you think about what's driving the machine, well, that's the brain, okay? But when you think about what makes up a person, if you want to get into the religious idea, what is a soul, we're talking about the mind. And this comes up with a concept called duality, and we'll get into that later in the course, but the idea that there is a separate mind from your physical being. And you'll see that a lot in especially religions of the world. Way back when we were first starting to look at the science of psychology, is early scientists would do something called mind mapping. And here's a picture of an old kind of cartoon that tried to mind map. So they would say, all right, well, where are all these elements in the brain? So where does the area of the brain that focuses on love, and where is the area of the brain that focuses on despair, and where is the area of the brain that focuses on jealousy? All those kind of things were tried to map out, and we assumed that there must be a spot, an address in your brain where those things happen. Subsequently, we've thought more of it as in kind of what's called a holistic way, which really means that's all something that's collected in this concept of the mind. And we'll talk more about mind down the road. Briefly, a little bit of history of psychology. It's a fairly new science. It's certainly considerably newer than most of the other sciences, and it's something that really began with the Enlightenment, and really kind of the father of the thought that led to psychology is a guy, a Frenchman named René Descartes, and here he is here. An attractive guy for sure. He was one of the first ones to propose that the mind was separate from the body. The mind controlled the body, but that there was a separate entity called the mind. And so he really did go through a process of thinking about, how does that work? How am I separate from my body? Am I just essentially kind of a robot, or is there something personal to me? And he felt that there is a mind, and that's unique to me. Over time, as we've gone from that time period, which was, just to give you an idea, around 1600 towards the common day, we've had a number of different approaches to psychology over time. One of them is called psychoanalysis. That was the type of psychology that was practiced by Sigmund Freud. Freud might be a name you're familiar with, probably the most famous psychologist, and we'll talk more about him. But psychoanalysis really talked about the concept of how the unconscious motives and conflicts, things that are going on in the mind, behind the scenes, something that we don't even know about, lead to driving our actions. So things that are buried deep. He would analyze dreams to try to figure out if that would give us a clue to who the person was. So psychoanalysis was really the concept that there's a lot going on underneath that we don't know about that's impacting the way we do things. Behavioral psychologists, and a couple of examples would be Pavlov or B.F. Skinner, and we'll talk about both of those and a little more detail about behavioral psychology in the future. But the behaviorists would say that human beings learn and modify their behavior based on their responses to things that happen in their environment. So we will do things based on a stimulus. Okay, and this is a very much a human being as just a regular animal kind of concept. So if we put our finger on a hot stove, we're going to take our finger off. It's a response to a stimulation. If somebody is mean to us over and over, we're going to learn that's a mean person. I'm going to stay away from him. Behavioral cause and effect was really their concept. Okay, we had the cognitive psychologists, and this is something that really is focused on education and learning. Piaget is an example of a cognitive psychologist, and he really looked at how we study the processes to store, retrieve, and use information. So how does the whole process of kind of coming up with kind of the mind as a computer, how do we bring in information, deal with it, and spit it out in some way we can use it? That's kind of cognitive psychology. Okay. We had the behavioralists, and then we had, not the behavioralists, but the biological psychologists. Biological psychologists really looked at how physical and chemical changes in our bodies influence our behavior. So us as an organism. So if behavioralism was us as an animal, biological is us as an organism. How are we a product of what's going on in our bodies that are just built in by the way that we function as an organism? And then finally, the most recent school of thought, approach to psychology, have been the sociocultural psychologists. And they've said, which makes a lot of sense to me, that your background influences a lot on who you are and how you think and how you process information. And that will be very different if you are a person that has lived their whole life in the United States versus a person that has lived their whole life maybe in China, or a person that's lived their whole life in Botswana, that those people would have different approaches to the world and thought. And so all of those things we will look at more in this course. A little bit of talking about psychology as a career, and just to give you an idea, again, we're back to terms here, and there's a couple of terms that sometimes are thrown around at the same time and are not, and we need to make sure we understand what the difference is. And that's, what is a psychologist versus what is a psychiatrist? And this is a toughie because they look almost exactly the same, and the first several letters are the same. And so it's easy to use them interchangeably. Just I want you to know that there are some differences. The first is that if we talk about a psychologist, psychologists are scientists. They're trained to observe, analyze, evaluate, and treat behaviors, generally in humans. There's animal psychologists as well, but predominantly they deal with human beings. Psychiatrists are medical doctors. So if a psychologist is a scientist, psychiatrists are doctors. Okay, so that's the difference. The doctors, psychiatrists can actually prescribe medicine to try to help with issues related to mental disorders, and that really is one of the main differences. So it's coming at the concept of how the mind and brain work from two different angles. One is more of the scientific end, the other is the medicinal or medical end. Some of the types of psychologists that you might find in the world, right here at our own school, we have an educational psychologist that deals with educational issues. The clinical psychologists, those are the folks that are probably treating people in an office, kind of the traditional idea of what you think about when you think about somebody going to a psychologist. There are developmental psychologists looking at the stages of development, generally from children through adolescents to adults. Industrial psychologists looking at the concept of how does work and how can we make it work better for human beings. And organizational psychologists, people that are looking at specific organizations to make sure that they are as good as they can be for the people and entities that work for them. Some of the questions that psychologists ask, and they're pretty profound, and we will actually go through an awful lot of these as we go through this class, are things like, what happens during sleep? Okay, we all fall asleep. We know that there's some dreaming going on in there. What's going on? What happens during that sleep process? What's happening with the brain? What's happening with the mind? Another question would be, can you measure intelligence? We have a number of different things that we use to try to figure out, the level of intelligence of people. And the classic is the IQ test. How valid is that? Can we really truly measure that? Are there multiple ways to measure intelligence? That might be a question. Do dreams mean anything? When you're dreaming and you have this bizarre dream and you wake up and you can remember, oh my goodness, here's what I was doing and this happened and then I fell, but I woke up before. All these kind of things that might happen in a dream, what do those mean? Can we analyze those and find anything about who we are in the real world based on our dream state? What is mental illness and how can it be treated? Why do some people view the world and interact with the world in ways that are different than others that we might consider to be abnormal? What's going on there? How does that happen? Is that a physical issue? Is it solely something going on mentally? What's happening there? Can memory be improved? This is a good one for students. What's the ability for me to improve my memory? And what are some diseases of memory? Things like Alzheimer's. What happens there when the memory starts to erode? And another good question, especially for parents or teachers, how does punishment or reward affect people? So if we punish somebody or we reward somebody, how does that interact with them and how does that make them a different person? So all of those are really intriguing questions, and it might be questions that we would sit down and talk about just normally, and that's really the place where psychologists work. That's the questions they ask, and those will be some of the questions potentially that you'll have an opportunity to study over the course of the next few weeks in this class. So hopefully that gives you a little information about what psychology is. Maybe you're a little more interested than you were before. We'll take this very, very basic overview and we'll start to break it down into little pieces as we study the science. So have a phenomenal week, get your work done, and we'll talk to you soon.